I will provide a paraphrased version of the script that maintains the same length, tone, and narrative style while achieving 100% uniqueness through careful word order adjustments and synonymous substitutions. Deep within the storage archives of a county hospital that has long since been demolished, there exist admission ledgers for a unit that was never formally inaugurated. These records stretch across nearly 14 years, commencing in the winter months of 1871 and continuing until the early part of 1885. Written in elegant copperplate script, they document the names of 43 individuals who were admitted under the supervision of a sole attending physician. What renders these files troubling is not the roster of names itself, but rather the adjacent column, the one designated for discharge dates, which for 31 of those 43 cases was simply never filled in. No notation of death, no record of transfer, no mention of escape, just a vacant space. For many years, these volumes remained in the cellar of a former government building in Upstate, New York, neglected and unindexed, tucked away beneath the documents belonging to a man whose medical credentials had been relinquished discreetly. Without any public inquiry, during the spring of 1885, his identity was Dr. Elias Gault. Had you approached any inhabitant of Harwick Hollow during that era and asked about his reputation, they would have responded unhesitatingly that he stood as the region's most distinguished doctor. A man of remarkable talent, dedicated above all else to ensuring the survival of those under his care. They were accurate in that final assessment. Before we proceed further into the narrative of Elias Gault and the ward that history overlooked, if this marks your first visit, we extend a warm welcome to Liturgy of Fear. Please subscribe and activate notifications so you won't miss future stories such as this one. We're also curious about where you're tuning in from. Feel free to mention your state or city in the comments. Now, let us transport ourselves back to the winter of 1871, to a valley in upstate New York where snowfall arrived prematurely and the afflicted had scarce alternatives. The settlement of Harwick Hollow was nestled at the floor of a slender glacial depression, roughly 40 miles to the northeast of Albany, squeezed between the Helderberg escarpment on its western side and an expansive growth of ancient hemlock forest to the east. This was not an affluent community. It had never enjoyed prosperity. The agricultural plots ascending the valley's modest slopes yielded sufficient rye and potatoes to sustain households through the harsh winters, yet generated little surplus capable of enticing the type of trade that might have fostered a genuine township. The hamlet contained a gristmill, a tavern, a dry goods store, a Methodist chapel with pale clapboard siding in need of repainting, and, as of 1868, a modest medical office of one room annexed to the rear of the Gault residence along Fallow Creek Road. The county administrative center was situated in Coxsackie, nearly a 2-hour journey by wagon when conditions permitted, which was infrequent between November and April. Prior to Elias Gault's arrival in Harwick Hollow during the autumn of 1866, the closest available physician had been an aging gentleman named Dr. Prentice Halverson, who traversed a route connecting 4 villages and was renowned as much for his partiality to Bourbon as for his medical proficiency. When Halverson perished from a stroke while attempting to cross a stream in the spring of 1866, the valley found itself utterly devoid of medical services. The local council, essentially composed of 3 farmers and the mill proprietor, had begun to quietly lose hope of securing any competent individual to assume his duties. Elias Gault was 32 years of age upon his arrival. He originated from Albany, where he had undertaken his formal education at Albany Medical College, subsequently dedicating 2 years to clinical work within the wards of Albany City Hospital. Those who worked alongside him would later characterize him as systematic, exacting, and extraordinarily patient, an individual who maintained meticulous documentation and revisited it repeatedly, who exhibited no signs of fatigue in confronting challenging cases even when fellow practitioners had already started discussing futility. He had authored a solitary article for the American Journal of Medical Sciences in 1864 concerning respiratory issues in patients convalescing from typhoid fever. The publication itself was unexceptional. What drew attention was its detached, nearly frigid tone, as though the afflictions of the individuals it portrayed were merely factors in a computational equation, rather than genuine suffering borne by actual human beings. Residents of Harwick Hollow did not peruse medical periodicals. Their perception was of a tall, lean figure with observant dark eyes and impeccably maintained hands, Gault, who appeared on a Tuesday carrying a leather trunk laden with surgical tools and reference volumes, leased the dwelling on Fallow Creek Road from the widow Tilda Musgrove, and established his practice within the week. He requested reasonable compensation. He conducted home visits regardless of weather. He abstained from alcohol. He appeared at the Methodist Church on Sundays, showing neither overt piety nor any noticeable reluctance. He maintained courtesy with all while cultivating intimacy with none. Within a single year, he had become the most esteemed individual throughout the valley. This trust was not without justification. During his inaugural winter in Harwick Hollow, a diphtheria epidemic swept through the farmsteads along the eastern ridge, claiming 6 young lives before Gault managed to confine it. He accomplished this by segregating the infected, imposing quarantine protocols with a rigidity that frustrated several landowners unable to leave their animals unattended, while simultaneously providing treatments, some derived from European sources not yet incorporated into mainstream American practice. This approach seemed to decelerate the illness's advancement in at least 3 instances, where mortality had been anticipated. The surviving children became a living testimony. Their families spoke of Gault with a veneration that the Methodist clergyman found somewhat disconcerting. By the early 1870s, the valley's populace had experienced modest growth, not due to economic prosperity, but through the influx of approximately 24 German immigrant households who had arrived to labor at the limestone quarry established on the escarpment in 1869. These newcomers carried with them their own afflictions, industrial injuries sustained from quarry operations, persistent respiratory conditions resulting from inhaling stone particulates, and among the elder men, the compounded deterioration from decades of strenuous labor in environments far harsher than anything Harwick Hollow presented. They also introduced a cultural regard for educated professionals that harmonized comfortably with the valley's pre-existing admiration for Gault's skills. It was specifically for these quarry laborers, along with the valley's most impoverished agricultural families, that Gault put forward the proposal for the ward. He approached the town council during the winter of 1870 with a proposition drafted in the same exacting handwriting that characterized his patient records. The valley, he maintained, required a facility dedicated to individuals whose conditions necessitated ongoing supervision, not the sort of attention that a family could supply while juggling farm responsibilities and caring for additional children, but rather the uninterrupted, skilled observation that only a specialized medical setting could furnish. He had already identified a suitable structure, the former Renner farmhouse located at the Hollow's terminus, which had remained vacant since the Renner family relocated to Ohio in 1868, and whose proprietor, an Albany-based individual who had inherited it without any particular interest, was amenable to leasing it for a moderate yearly fee. The council endorsed the initiative with a degree of reluctance. One member, a farmer by the name of Cornelius Vander, brought up the matter of supervision. Who would conduct inspections of the premises? Who would guarantee that its procedures adhered to the county medical board's regulations? Gault responded evenly that he would preserve comprehensive documentation and present it annually to the county medical officer. As prescribed by legislation, the establishment would not function as a formal hospital, he clarified, but rather as a private care residence operating under his professional license, which exempted it from certain regulatory constraints while still upholding professional standards. Vander remained less than fully convinced. Yet his fellow council members were persuaded, and the resolution carried by a vote of 3-1. Construction efforts on the Renner farmhouse commenced in the spring of 1871. By November of that same year, the ward, as it came to be designated, despite having no official title, was prepared to accept its initial occupants. The first individual admitted was a quarry worker named August Brenner, aged 47, originally from Baden-Württemberg, who had resided in the valley for 2 years and whose pulmonary condition, Gault concluded, had been seriously compromised by stone dust inhalation. Brenner's respiratory function had declined throughout the autumn to such an extent that he could no longer perform his work, and his wife, Martha, had depleted her strength attempting to tend to him while simultaneously managing their 4 offspring and the modest kitchen garden that augmented their household income. When Gault proposed that August could gain from the ward's resources, consistent monitoring, suitable air circulation, a nutritional plan adjusted to his particular needs, Martha Brenner consented with the relief of a woman who had been shouldering an unsustainable burden. She paid a visit the following Sunday. The farmhouse had been converted into a spotless and organized space, with 4 beds situated in the primary room and 2 more in a smaller chamber adjacent to the kitchen, which Gault had expanded through a lean-to addition. Linen draperies adorned the windows, a wood-burning stove maintained warm and dry air, and there was an odor that Martha associated with a medical facility she had briefly visited in Baden during her girlhood. Carbolic, sharp, exact, Elias Gault greeted her at the entrance wearing his white coat and escorted her to August's bedside. August was seated upright, breathing with greater ease than he had experienced in months. He clasped Martha's hand and informed her that the meals were satisfactory, and that the doctor examined him twice daily. He also mentioned that he was finally sleeping through the nights for the first time since summer. Martha Brenner departed feeling reassured. She returned the subsequent Sunday and the Sunday following that. On the 3rd Sunday of January 1872, she arrived to discover that August had been relocated to the smaller chamber beside the kitchen. Gault explained that the main room was now occupied by a patient requiring more acute care, and that August's status had become sufficiently stable that he could be moved without any negative impact on his treatment. He conveyed this gently, clearly, and with the composed demeanor that valley residents had come to equate with absolute reliability. Martha nodded and proceeded to see her husband. She observed that the door to the small chamber now featured a newly installed bolt on its exterior. She made no mention of the bolt that day. She rationalized it to herself as a measure for privacy, or to block drafts, or for some other reasonable medical purpose that she lacked the knowledge to fully comprehend. Yet the bolt lingered in her consciousness, much like an unexpected noise persists in one's hearing long after it has faded. When she returned the next week, a woman she did not recognize responded at the front entrance and informed her that the doctor was unavailable and that Sunday visiting hours had been adjusted to a 2-hour window starting at 2:00 in the afternoon. Martha had arrived at 1:30. She stood outside in the cold for 30 minutes, after which she was admitted and guided to August, who was positioned identically to the previous week, in the same chair with the same blanket draped across his knees. He reported feeling well. His voice carried a monotone quality that Martha could not precisely define. When she inquired whether he wished to return home, now that his breathing had improved, he replied that the doctor considered it premature. When she pressed him about the doctor's exact words, he hesitated, a pause she would retain in her memory for the remainder of her existence, and stated that he could not quite recollect. Outside, trudging back through the snow along the hollow roadway, Martha Brenner attempted to identify the source of her unease. Her husband remained alive. His respiration had improved. The facility was sanitary, well-ordered, and supervised by a physician whom everyone esteemed. She possessed no tangible proof of any impropriety. Only the bolt, and the hesitation, and the flatness of his voice, and a sensation, which she could neither validate nor dispel, that her husband was being preserved within that dwelling in the manner of a specimen enclosed in a jar, maintained and motionless and entirely under another's control. She was unaware, as she made her way home through the chill of late January, that she had just experienced the final genuine exchange with August Brenner that would ever occur. He continued to reside within the ward for another 6 years. Life in the valley proceeded as it always does. The quarry expanded operations. 3 of the German families acquired agricultural land and began establishing themselves permanently. A second general store opened its doors. The Methodist Church received its long overdue coat of paint. Elias Gault's ward, in the intervening years, accepted a gradual yet consistent influx of patients. Some were referred by Gault himself following house calls, while others came via recommendations from surrounding communities that had started to learn about the facility. 1 or 2 arrived in family carriages, transported by relatives from as far as Albany, who had been assured by acquaintances that Gault could address conditions that other practitioners had abandoned. The ward underwent further expansion. By 1875, Gault had constructed a complete second story on the Renner farmhouse and converted the lean-to into a fully integrated wing. A woman named Theodora Kepler, who had received nursing training at a facility in Utica and had relocated to Harwick Hollow to tend to an aging aunt, was employed as the ward's sole permanent staff member apart from Gault himself. Kepler proved to be competent and reserved, and she assured any inquirer that the work was gratifying and that Dr. Gault was an outstanding physician. She delivered these statements without emotional warmth, adopting the same measured, neutral inflection that Gault himself employed in most of his communications. Among the families whose relatives had been admitted to the ward, a current of anxiety slowly built, analogous to the way ice forms on a placid lake, imperceptible in its progression, until one day you step onto what appeared to be water and discover it solid beneath your weight. Martha Brenner was not the sole spouse, offspring, or sibling who had observed something they could not articulate. Carl Fritsch, whose father Otto had been admitted during the spring of 1873 for a serious lower leg infection resulting from a quarry incident, noted that his father's progress, which Gault documented consistently and thoroughly, never appeared to translate into any realistic chance of release. Whenever Carl asked when his father might return, Gault would cite another complication, another stage of therapy that needed to conclude, another risk of recurrence that would be negligent to disregard. The explanations were consistently credible. They were offered with the same composed, systematic tone, and they invariably concluded with Carl Fritsch heading back down the hollow road, feeling somewhat foolish for having raised the question. There was also the issue of documentation. When a patient expired within the ward, and some certainly did, the elderly, the gravely ill, those whose conditions had advanced beyond the reach even of Gault's interventions. Gault submitted death certificates to the county as mandated, and these were properly entered into the records in Coxsackie. Yet the certificates were submitted in groups, occasionally months subsequent to the actual demise, and the causes indicated were consistently the patient's initial presenting condition, pulmonary disease, systemic infection, cardiac arrest. No county medical inspector had ever toured the ward to examine its documentation or its physical environment. This was not inherently suspicious. County medical oversight in rural New York during the 1870s was, for all practical purposes, essentially absent. However, it meant that Gault's admission logs in his discharge paperwork, those featuring the vacant column, existed solely within his personal files at the farmhouse located at the Hollow's End during the summer of 1876. An itinerant preacher by the name of Absalom Crane passed through Harwick Hollow as part of his yearly circuit of the valley communities. Crane was not an especially notable individual in most regards, yet he possessed keen observation skills, and he had traveled through the valley during each of the preceding 6 years. He noted alterations and absences of alteration. He observed that the former Renner farmhouse was significantly more extensive than during his previous visit. He observed additional chimneys, and that the draperies on what appeared to be upper floor windows were perpetually closed. He observed that when he inquired, at the inn that evening, about the facility at the Hollow's End, the innkeeper, a direct, spoken man named Peter Schuller, hesitated before responding, in a manner that Crane interpreted as intentional. "It's the doctor's establishment," Schuller eventually replied. "Gault's ward, and it provides beneficial care?" Crane asked. Schuller met his gaze steadily. "Individuals enter," he stated. Crane waited. "And they seldom emerge again," Schuller added, before turning aside to wipe the bar and offering no further comment on the subject. Crane sat with his evening meal and reflected on Schuller's words. He pondered them throughout the remainder of his circuit, and upon his return to Albany in the autumn, he mentioned the matter almost incidentally during a dinner conversation with a colleague, a man named James Aldgate, who worked as a reporter for the Albany Evening Journal and who gathered peculiar observations in the manner that others accumulate stamps. Aldgate recorded nothing immediately, but he retained the details. Elias Gault, Harwick Hollow, and initiated, quietly and without urgency, a process of investigation. It required James Aldgate nearly 2 years to compile sufficient information to convince himself that he was confronting a genuine phenomenon rather than an assortment of unrelated grievances and gossip. He was a meticulous reporter, meticulous enough to have learned through difficult experience the distinction between a substantive story and a simple complaint, and the repercussions of confusing the two. Consequently, he proceeded deliberately. He acquired, through the county clerk's office in Coxsackie, the death certificates that Gault had filed between 1871 and 1878. There were 11 of them. He cross-referenced these against the intake records he had managed to reconstruct partially through conversations with families of admitted patients. The arithmetic was concerning. Through those interviews, he could confirm at least 28 individuals who had been admitted to the ward during that time frame. 11 possessed death certificates. He was unable to locate any documentation indicating that the remaining 17 had ever been discharged. He journeyed to Harwick Hollow in the autumn of 1878, spending 4 days at the inn and engaging in discussions with anyone prepared to converse with him. which proved to be fewer individuals than he had anticipated. Peter Schuler, who had initially planted the seed 2 years earlier through the circuit preacher's account, spoke with him extensively, though always in the inn's back room, and only after verifying that no others were within earshot. What Schiller related was not sensational. It consisted of a collection of minor, routine observations that together composed an image Aldgate found profoundly disconcerting. Schiller had noticed patients in the ward's courtyard during the warmer seasons, seated in chairs or moving slowly near the garden that Kepler maintained on the building's southern side. He had once conversed with a man he recognized as Emil Vorst, a farmer from the valley's northern extremity who had been admitted 2 years previously for a severe winter malady that had nearly proven fatal. Vorst had recovered. This was evident to any observer. He was ambulating independently, speaking coherently, and displaying no overt indications of serious illness. Schiller had inquired when he might return home, and Vorst had regarded him with an expression Schiller could only characterize as deliberately neutral, responding that the physician had not yet deemed it safe. Kepler then appeared around the building's side. Vorst averted his gaze, and the exchange concluded. That phrase, deliberately neutral, became fixed in Aldgate's thinking. He had encountered variations of it from Marta Brenner, who still visited her husband August every Sunday, 4 years after his admission, even though August no longer seemed to acknowledge her consistently. He had encountered it from Karl Fritsch, who had been denied access to his father Otto for over a year, Gault having explained that the elder Fritsch was undergoing a sensitive treatment phase demanding complete rest and minimal external stimulation. He had encountered it from a woman named Louisa Tanner, whose mother had been admitted in 1874 and who had received, 3 months later, a death certificate citing cardiac failure as the cause. Though Louisa's mother, during Louisa's last visit, had been ambulatory, coherent, and showing no visible distress. Aldgate was a journalist, not a physician, and he recognized the boundaries of his expertise. Yet, he had covered Albany City Hospital for 2 years and possessed some familiarity with medical practice. What he was hearing indicated a pattern he could not attribute to mere incompetence. Incompetence resulted in patient loss. It did not result in patient retention. He solicited an interview with Gault. Gault consented, which took Aldgate by surprise. Their meeting occurred in the ward's front parlor on a cold Thursday in November. The space was exactly as sanitary and orderly as all accounts had described: whitewashed surfaces, scoured floorboards, linen curtains filtering the flat gray November daylight, a faint scent of carbolic acid that was not displeasing. Gault sat opposite Aldgate, hands folded upon his knees, and responded to each inquiry in his measured, deliberate voice. The death certificates were correct. The cases Aldgate had referenced were too confidential to discuss in detail. As patient privacy constituted a professional duty, he treated with seriousness. The facility's records were accessible to the county medical officer upon formal request. He had nothing to conceal and took offense at any suggestion otherwise. Aldgate inquired, as tactfully as possible, about those patients who appeared to have recovered yet remained undischarged. Gault regarded him briefly. He then stated that recovery did not equate to cure, Mr. Aldgate. An individual who ceases coughing may remain infectious. A woman whose fever subsides may experience an unexpected relapse. To discharge a patient prematurely, before their condition had been entirely resolved, represented, in his professional estimation, a greater cruelty than retaining them slightly longer than their family might desire. He had witnessed the consequences of premature home returns. He had seen individuals perish in beds where their children slept. He had observed entire households devastated by illnesses that adequate isolation could have terminated. His methods might be uncomfortable, but they were correct. It was an entirely logical response. It was the type of answer that defied argument, being rooted in authentic medical reasoning and expressed in terms of patient welfare. Gault departed the ward that afternoon without having identified any specific deficiency he could cite as evidence of wrongdoing. He carried only a sensation, lingering cold, distinct, that he had just been skillfully managed by an individual with considerable experience in such management. He returned to Albany and commenced composing the sole article he could legitimately produce, not an accusation, but an inquiry. The piece appeared in the Albany Evening Journal on February 14, 1879. It was cautious, balanced, and deeply unsettling to those who examined it attentively. Gault did not level any criminal charges against Gault. He outlined the ward's procedures, the family's anxieties, and the discrepancy between admissions and documented discharges. He presented a series of questions directed nominally to the county medical board concerning oversight of private care facilities in rural districts. He named no patients, referenced no specific instances, and made no claim that could not be substantiated by verifiable evidence. It was, from both legal and journalistic perspectives, an exemplary work of restrained reporting. Within Harwick Hollow, however, it was perceived as an act of hostility. Gault's advocates, numerous as they were, given his 13-year tenure as the Valley's physician and the lives he had genuinely preserved during that period, were incensed. The town council convened a session at which Cornelius Vander, now older and somewhat more accommodating toward Gault, proposed that the council dispatch a letter to the journal affirming its faith in the physician's integrity and the facility's operations. The motion carried unanimously. The minister delivered a sermon the subsequent Sunday, addressing the sin of defamation. 3 of the German families, whose relatives were not patients, at the ward distributed a petition, endorsed by 42 residents attesting to Gault's professional ethics. Martha Brenner declined to sign it, nor did Karl Fritsch. There were 4 or 5 others, quieter, less inclined to attract notice, who also refrained from signing, and who in the weeks following the article's publication became objects of a social pressure that fell short of outright ostracism, but produced largely identical outcomes. The Valley had determined its position, and that position was allegiance to Elias Gault. Those who dissented represented an awkward element within a community that had structured itself around his proficiency for over a decade. Yet Gault's article had also been read in Albany, where it reached the desk of the state medical board's administrative secretary, a methodical man named Horace Delacroix, who treated his duty to investigate credible complaints against licensed practitioners with seriousness. Delacroix wrote to Gault requesting a formal submission of patient records spanning the preceding 5 years. The correspondence was courteously phrased and presented as a routine administrative request. It arrived at the Gault residence on Fallow Creek Road during the 3rd week of February. What transpired subsequently is documented only indirectly. A farm laborer named Silas Prout, who occasionally assisted with deliveries along the Hollow Road, later informed Gault that he had observed, on the evening of February 23rd, a substantial quantity of smoke issuing from the chimney of the ward's new stone outbuilding, the structure added to the property in 1876, that appeared to function as storage for the ward's records and provisions. It was, Prout stated, more smoke than a heating fire would generate. It was the kind of smoke produced by burning paper. 3 weeks afterward, Gault submitted to the state medical board a set of records covering only the years 1876 to 1879. indicating for that period 19 patient admissions and 19 corresponding discharges or death certificates. The documentation was clean, readable, and internally coherent. Delacroix examined it, identified no immediate anomalies, and archived it. For the time being, the investigation concluded. However, something else had been set in motion. Among the families who had read Aldgate's article and recognized themselves in its implicit questions, there emerged a gradual consolidation of resolve. They had been isolated from one another, each household managing its own uncertainties, its own carefully constructed rationalizations, its own reluctance to appear ungrateful to the individual who had, after all, preserved their relative's existence. Yet the article had demonstrated that they were not isolated, that others were posing the same inquiries, that the inquiries themselves were not irrational. Martha Brenner composed a letter to James Aldgate. Carl Fritsch did likewise. Eventually, a woman named Hedwig Rausch followed suit, whose brother Conrad had been admitted in 1874 and who had ceased receiving any communication from the ward in 1877. When Gault had notified her by mail that Conrad's condition had worsened beyond the point where visits could be permitted, Conrad Rausch would have been 41 years old in 1879. His death certificate, which Gault had not yet submitted, did not exist. During the spring of 1879, Aldgate returned to Harwick Hollow, carrying the letters in his coat pocket and a significantly sharper understanding of what he was confronting. This time, he did not request a meeting with Gault. He proceeded directly to the ward and requested to see the patients. Kepler greeted him at the door. She was courteous and unyielding. The ward was not accessible for unannounced visits. The doctor was unavailable. She would relay his request. Aldgate specifically asked to see August Brenner. Kepler responded that Mr. Brenner's care requirements precluded unannounced visits. Aldgate asked to see Conrad Rausch. Kepler's expression remained unchanged, though something behind her eyes shifted in a manner that Aldgate observed and noted. She stated she had no knowledge of a patient by that designation. Aldgate informed her that Conrad Rausch had been admitted to this facility in July 1874 and had not been reported as discharged or deceased. Kepler replied that she could not address individual patient matters. She delivered this with complete composure. She then closed the door. Standing on the steps of the former Renner farmhouse in the gentle April sunlight, listening to the sound of the bolt sliding into place on the opposite side of that door, James Aldgate understood with a clarity that coursed through him like cold water that he was not examining a story about mere negligence. The investigation that ensued was neither rapid nor straightforward. It did not yield the type of dramatic singular revelation that makes for a satisfying narrative. What it did produce was a steady accumulation of pressures, legal, medical, and journalistic, that eventually rendered Elias Gault's position unsustainable in a manner that all his careful management could not overcome. It commenced with Martha Brenner. In May of 1879, Martha Brenner engaged legal counsel, a young attorney in Coxsackie named de Vierux Hollis, who had read Aldgate's article and agreed at a discounted rate to pursue a formal petition to the county court for access to her husband. The petition contended that Martha, as August Brenner's spouse, possessed a legal entitlement to information regarding his condition and to participate in decisions about his care. It was a simple legal contention, and Hollis articulated it effectively. The county judge, a prudent individual named Orville Strang, who was conscious of Gault's community standing and hesitant to provoke discord, nonetheless signed the order in June, finding no legal justification for denial. Gault's response, submitted through his own Albany-based attorney, characterized August Brenner's condition as one of serious mental deterioration. The consequence, he alleged, of the original pulmonary disease's effect on August's neurological functioning. He submitted a medical report in his own handwriting depicting an individual no longer capable of autonomous action or coherent communication, requiring continuous institutional care for his own protection and that of others. He argued that Martha Brenner's visits, rather than benefiting August, were causing him distress and impeding his treatment. Judge Strang appointed an impartial physician from Albany, a man named Dr. Francis Cleary, to assess August Brenner's condition and submit a report to the court. Cleary visited the ward on a Tuesday morning in August 1879. He was accompanied by a county constable, a fact of which Gault had not been apprised, and which Kepler, upon meeting them at the door, had no legal authority to refuse. Gault himself was not present. He was at his office on Fallow Creek Road. Kepler conducted them through the ward with the composed deliberation of someone who had prepared for this scenario many times. What Cleary discovered in the ward's main room were 3 patients, all elderly, all recumbent, all in states of apparent sedation. He inspected them briefly and recorded in his notes the odor he associated with laudanum, the opium tincture that was, during the 1870s, lawful, commonly accessible, and frequently misused. He observed that the patient's muscle tone indicated extended immobility, and that one of the 3, a woman whose identity he could not ascertain, as no names were posted, exhibited signs of pressure sores consistent with months or years of confinement to bed. He requested that Kepler show him the remaining patients. Kepler responded that the other rooms were occupied and could not be disturbed. The constable stated that the court order encompassed the entire facility. Kepler said she would need to consult with Dr. Gault. The constable informed her that was not presently an available option and moved past her into the hallway. The second and third rooms each held 2 patients in conditions similar to those in the main room. The small chamber adjacent to the kitchen, the one with the bolt on its exterior, contained a single patient. Cleary estimated the man's age at roughly 50, which corresponded to August Brenner's age in 1879. The man was conscious, seated in a chair beside the window, and he regarded Cleary upon Cleary's entrance with the slow, slightly diffuse attention of someone who had been in a chemically subdued condition for an extended period. Cleary asked his name. The man replied, after a pause, that his name was August. Cleary asked what month it was. August gazed out the window at the summer brightness, then returned his gaze to Cleary and stated he did not know. Cleary asked if he wished to return home. August remained silent for a considerable period. Then he said, slowly and with evident effort, "I don't think the doctor wants me to." That phrase, 6 words spoken by a man who appeared physically recovered from the respiratory illness that had constituted his admission's original basis for admission 8 years prior, formed the core of Francis Cleary's report to the court. The report concluded that August Brenner exhibited no indications of active disease requiring institutional care, that his cognitive impairment appeared consistent with extended administration of sedative agents rather than neurological deterioration, and that his continued retention in the facility was, in Cleary's professional estimation, medically unjustified. The report further noted cautiously that the ward's population seemed to consist predominantly of individuals who had, based on all physical evidence, recovered from their admitting conditions and were being sustained in a pharmacological state that prevented them from exercising or expressing any desire to depart. Gault was summoned before the State Medical Board in October 1879. He arrived equipped with records references and a thorough defense of his treatment protocols. He argued that Cleary's observations reflected those of a general practitioner unfamiliar with the specific intricacies of long-term chronic care. He argued that the medications he employed were standard elements of any responsible treatment regimen for patients with the profiles his ward served. He argued that Martha Brenner's petition stemmed from a misunderstanding regarding her husband's condition, amplified by irresponsible journalism. He was convincing, he had always been convincing, and the board in 1879 was not positioned to act decisively on what it possessed. A pattern of questionable evidence, rather than a single identifiable offense. Yet they continued to observe, and through that observation, further details emerged. Hedwig Rausch finally demanded a formal accounting of her brother Conrad. Gault filed a death certificate in December 1879, listing the cause as pneumonia and the date of death as September of the preceding year. Hedwig, with Hollis's assistance, petitioned for access to burial records. The cemetery on the Hollow Road had no listing for Conrad Rausch. Gault explained that Conrad had been interred on the ward's property, which he owned, at the family's request. A request, Hedwig stated for the record, that had never been made by any family member, since no family member had been notified of Conrad's death until 15 months after it had allegedly transpired. An investigation of the ward's grounds, conducted in the spring of 1880, uncovered evidence of a small enclosed area on the building's north side that appeared to have functioned as a burial plot. It contained the remains of at least 4 individuals. 3 were ultimately identified through meticulous efforts to match physical characteristics against intake records. Conrad Rausch, a quarry laborer named Philip Ostern, and a woman from an adjacent valley whose family had been informed she was discharged in 1875. The 4th was never identified. Gault maintained throughout the entire process that the burials had occurred with the family's knowledge and consent, that the deaths had resulted from natural causes consistent with the patient's conditions, and that the delay in documentation was an administrative oversight, not intentional concealment. He was questioned, repeatedly and across several legal forums, regarding the blank discharge column. He described it as a clerical system he had since updated. He characterized it as an artifact of his record-keeping approach. He insisted it signified nothing. The board could not establish that it signified anything definitive, but they possessed sufficient grounds, and in the spring of 1885, they acted accordingly. They determined that his practice of administering sedative compounds to patients without documented medical justification, his failure to maintain adequate death records, and his pattern of obstructing legitimate family access to patients constituted adequate grounds for the surrender of his license. The proceedings were administrative rather than criminal. There was no trial. There was no jury. There was a closed session, a formal arrangement, and Elias Gault's signature on a document stating that he would terminate medical practice in the state of New York immediately and permanently. He departed Harwick Hollow that spring. He traveled westward. There were accounts years afterward that placed him in Pennsylvania, then Ohio, then still further, always in jurisdictions where his name had not preceded him. The ward on the Renner farmhouse property was vacated, and its remaining patients, 6 of them, including August Brenner, were restored to their families or, in 2 instances where no family existed to receive them, transferred to the county poorhouse. August Brenner returned home to Martha in April 1885. He had been within the ward for 13 years. He was 60 years old, and he moved with the careful uncertainty of someone relearning a skill. He had no specific recollection of the years between approximately 1875 and 1885. They existed for him as a type of gray void punctuated by occasional fragments: a window, a chair, the odor of carbolic and laudanum, Kepler's footsteps in the hallway. He lived for another 4 years. He passed away in his own bed during the autumn of 1889, with Martha beside him. His death certificate, filed by the county physician, listed the cause as heart failure. It was accurate. The question that James Aldgate dedicated the final years of his career to addressing was not whether Elias Gault had committed wrongdoing. The evidence for that was adequate, even if it had never been adequate for criminal conviction. The question that prevented his sleep, that he revisited in his notes and in the extended, careful essays he published after the ward's closure, was a simpler and more terrible one. Why? Not why in the abstract, not what was amiss with an individual capable of such actions, but why specifically, mechanically, in terms of Gault's own articulated beliefs. Because Gault had, on numerous occasions, provided explanations, not as admissions of fault, but as defenses of a philosophy. The extended administration of sedatives, he contended, represented a legitimate instrument for managing patients whose conditions rendered them challenging to treat through conventional approaches. The prolonged stays were a necessary outcome of treating recovery with seriousness, of declining to discharge patients before he was certain, completely certain, that they would not relapse, would not transmit disease, would not return to him in worse condition than when they had arrived. He spoke of it as a form of care that families were too emotional, too impatient, too medically uninformed to comprehend. Aldgate believed, ultimately, that this was not entirely fabrication. He believed that somewhere within the system Gault had constructed at Harwick Hollow resided a genuine medical conviction that if he could simply regulate all variables, if he could sustain his patients in a state of perfectly controlled stability, if he could prevent the unpredictable intrusions of the external world, and the patient's own decisions, and the chaos of ordinary existence, he could achieve outcomes that standard medicine could not. He believed that what Gault characterized as keeping his patients alive too long was, within Gault's own framework, not a corruption of care, but its ultimate manifestation. What rendered Gault dangerous was not indifference to his patients. It was that he cared for them in a manner that allowed no place for their autonomy, their relationships, their own experience of their existence. They were cases to be supervised, not individuals to be restored to their lives, and the institution he established, sanitary, systematic, credible at every level, and cloaked in the impenetrable authority of medical expertise, was ideally structured to prevent anyone from contesting that framework until the damage had already been inflicted. Theodora Kepler departed Harwick Hollow during the same week as Gault. She was never summoned before any legal body, as the investigators concluded that she had consistently followed physicians' orders and could not be held accountable for the outcomes those orders produced. Whether she had known, at any stage, that her participation was wrongful, whether she had suppressed that awareness or rationalized it, or simply concluded that the physician's authority superseded her own judgment, remained a question without a definitive answer. She never provided an account of her service at the ward. She disappeared into another existence elsewhere, perhaps under another name, and left behind no documentation of herself that anyone has located. The Renner farmhouse remained vacant for several years after the ward's closure. It was eventually acquired by a family from Albany who utilized it as a summer residence and who, reportedly, knew nothing of its prior history. By the early 20th century, it had undergone extensive renovation. By mid-century, the original structure was scarcely discernible beneath the additions. Ultimately, like so many edifices in valleys that time gradually abandons, it descended into decay, and then into the type of ruin that becomes indistinguishable from the environment. and then into the earth itself. The admission ledgers, those containing the empty discharge column, were maintained in a county records repository that changed ownership multiple times over the subsequent decades. They were misclassified as a general hospital register from a defunct institution and stored under a heading unlikely to attract any search. They remained there for nearly a century, undisturbed 40, 3 names and 30, 1 blanks, awaiting someone who recognized their significance. When they were eventually examined during a local historical society's survey of county medical records, the archivist who opened the volume observed in her report that the handwriting in the discharge column was exceptionally neat, that it displayed no indications of correction or alteration, that whoever had maintained these records had always intended from the outset to leave those spaces vacant. She was uncertain how to interpret this. She recorded it accurately and proceeded to the subsequent box. Some questions, it appears, are resolved not through revelations, but through the gradual, meticulous accumulation of details that resist explanation. The blank column, the bolt on the exterior of the door, the deliberate smoke from the outbuilding chimney on a February evening. The 6 words spoken by a man who had been sustained carefully, methodically, professionally, sustained for 8 years beyond any medical necessity, sitting in a chair by a window with the summer light filtering in, stating that he did not believe the doctor wished him to return home. This mystery illustrates something about the character of authority and the peril of expertise exercised without accountability. How an institution can originate from authentic concern and nonetheless become a prison. How an individual can dedicate their existence to a principle and employ that principle to justify actions that should never have been permitted. What are your reflections on this story? Do you believe everything was uncovered? What are your thoughts on Elias Gault's fate after heading west? Do you think he ceased his practices? Please share your comments below. If you found this narrative compelling and desire additional dark histories similar to this one, please subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Activate the notification bell and share this video with anyone who appreciates the enigma's history leaves in its wake. These are the tales that never graced the front pages, yet they have never truly vanished either. We'll see you in the next installment.